Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy World channel. Tonight, we journey back through time to a world of longships cutting through cold northern seas, of warriors and explorers who sailed farther than anyone thought possible, and of a people whose story has been both celebrated and misunderstood for over 1,000 years. The Vikings. When you hear that word, you might picture horned helmets and battle axes. But the truth is far more fascinating. The Vikings were farmers and poets, traders and craftsmen, storytellers who passed down sagas by firelight, and navigators who crossed oceans without compasses. They built intricate jewelry, valued cleanliness, and created democratic assemblies centuries before most of Europe. They were complex, curious, and remarkably human. Tonight, we'll uncover 100 quiet truths about these Norse seafarers. Some will surprise you, others may feel familiar, like echoes from a distant past that still shapes our world today. We'll explore their ships and their gods, their daily lives, and their greatest journeys, their words that still live in our language, and the land they left behind. If you enjoy these peaceful explorations into history and science, feel free to like and subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, let your breathing slow, let the world outside fade, and let's begin our journey into the world of the Vikings. Vikings never actually wore horned helmets. One of the most enduring images of Vikings is entirely fictional. Those iconic horned helmets you see in movies and costumes were never worn by Norse warriors. Not a single Viking helmet with horns has ever been found by archaeologists. The misconception likely came from 19th century romantic artwork and opera costumes that imagined Vikings as wild, primitive warriors. In reality, Viking helmets were simple, practical iron or leather caps, sometimes with nose guards for protection. Horns would have been dangerously impractical in battle, giving opponents something to grab or knock you off balance with. The real Vikings were far too clever for such a handicap. When you imagine them now, picture instead the streamlined efficiency of people who understood that survival meant intelligence, not spectacle. The word Viking was actually a verb, not a noun. To go Viking meant to go raiding or on an adventure overseas. It wasn't what these people called themselves as a whole. Most Norse people during this era were simply farmers, craftsmen, and traders who never left their homelands. The ones who went Viking were a subset, those who took to the sea for wealth, glory, or new lands. In their own language, they might have called themselves Norse, Northmen, or identified by their specific region or family. The word itself likely comes from Vik, meaning bay or inlet, referring to those who came from the fjords. So when we speak of Vikings, we're really talking about the adventurers, the ones who looked at the horizon and couldn't resist seeing what lay beyond it. Vikings were extraordinarily clean for their time. While medieval Europeans often bathed infrequently, Vikings were meticulous about personal hygiene. They bathed at least once a week, which was remarkably often for the era, and many bathed daily. Archaeologists have found tweezers, razors, combs, and ear cleaners in Viking graves, showing how much they valued grooming. They even had a special day, Saturday, which they called Laugardagur, or Washing Day. English chronicles from the time complained that Viking men were attracting English women with their clean habits and well-groomed appearance. They combed their beards, styled their hair, and some even bleached their beards blonde using a special soap. In a time when cleanliness was rare, the Vikings stood out, proving that these so-called barbarians often took better care of themselves than the people who looked down on them. Their ships could sail in just 1 meter of water. The Viking longship was a masterpiece of engineering, so well designed that its basic principles influenced shipbuilding for centuries. These vessels had a shallow draft, meaning they could navigate in remarkably shallow water, sometimes just 1 meter deep. This allowed Vikings to sail up rivers as deep into continents, appearing suddenly where no one expected ships to reach. The ships were also light enough to be carried overland when necessary, portaged between waterways. Built from overlapping planks in a technique called clinker building, they were both flexible and strong, able to bend with waves rather than fight them. Fast, maneuverable, and beautiful, these ships were the key to Viking expansion. They weren't just tools, they were extensions of the Viking spirit, built for both war and exploration, equally at home on the open ocean or slipping quietly up a river at dawn. Vikings discovered America 500 years before Columbus. Long before Columbus set sail, Vikings had already reached the Americas. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson led an expedition that landed in what he called Vinland, now believed to be Newfoundland in Canada. Archaeological evidence at L'Anse aux Meadows confirms a Norse settlement there, with remains of buildings identical to those found in Greenland and Iceland. The Vikings explored the coast, encountering indigenous peoples they called Skraelings, and attempted to establish permanent colonies, though they ultimately didn't last. The sagas tell of these journeys, passed down through generations before being written down. For half a millennium, this achievement remained largely forgotten by the wider world until the evidence could no longer be denied. The Vikings had crossed the Atlantic in open boats, found a new world, and returned home to tell the tale, 5 centuries before the age of exploration officially began. They had a sophisticated legal system with assemblies called things. Despite their reputation for violence, Vikings had a complex and surprisingly democratic legal system. Free men would gather at assemblies called things, where disputes were settled, laws were debated, and decisions were made collectively. The most famous was the Althing in Iceland, established in 930 AD and considered one of the world's oldest parliaments. At these gatherings, grievances were aired, crimes were punished through fines or outlawry, and even kings could be held accountable. There were no judges in our modern sense. Instead, a law speaker would recite the laws from memory, and disputes were settled through argument and consensus. Women could bring cases, and slaves could eventually earn their freedom. It wasn't perfect equality, but it was remarkably progressive for its time, showing that Vikings valued order and justice as much as they valued strength and courage. Viking women had more rights than most European women of the time. In Viking society, women held a status that wouldn't be matched in much of Europe for centuries. They could own property, inherit wealth, and run farms while their husbands were away. If a marriage was unhappy, a woman could initiate divorce simply by declaring it in front of witnesses and reclaiming her dowry. Women managed the household keys, a symbol of authority, and controlled domestic affairs entirely. Some women were buried with weapons, suggesting they may have fought, though this is still debated. Others were clearly merchants, with scales and waits in their graves. While not equal to men in all ways, Viking women had autonomy and respect that was extraordinary for the early medieval period. In a time when women elsewhere were often treated as property, Norse women could be landowners, business managers, and decision makers. They believed the world would end in a great battle called Ragnarok. Viking mythology was filled with stories of gods and giants, but it all led toward one inevitable conclusion: Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. According to their beliefs, this apocalyptic battle would see the gods themselves fall. Odin would be swallowed by the wolf Fenrir, Thor would die fighting the serpent Jörmungandr, and Loki would lead the forces of chaos against Asgard. The world would burn, the seas would rise, and nearly everything would be destroyed. But Ragnarok wasn't quite the end. After the devastation, the world would be reborn, green and fertile, populated by the surviving gods and 2 human survivors who had hidden in the world tree. This cyclical view of time, where destruction leads to renewal, shaped how Vikings saw existence itself. Death and ending weren't to be feared but accepted, because even in endings, there were new beginnings. Vikings practiced a form of poetry with strict rules called skaldic verse. The Vikings were not just warriors, but poets, and their poetry was remarkably complex. Skaldic verse, the most prestigious form, followed intricate rules of meter, alliteration, and used elaborate metaphors called kennings. A ship might be called a wave steed, the sea the whale road, blood battle sweat. These poems required years of training to compose properly, and skilled skalds were valued members of royal courts, hired to commemorate battles and praise kings. Their verses served as both entertainment and historical record, preserving the deeds of great men in an age before widespread literacy. Many of these poems were memorized and passed down through generations before finally being written in manuscripts centuries later. In the long winter nights, around crackling fires, Vikings didn't just tell stories. They transformed them into art, proving that the same people who raided monasteries also crafted some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated literature. They used a type of crystal to navigate on cloudy days. Viking navigation is still somewhat mysterious to us, but they had techniques that worked remarkably well. One fascinating discovery is their possible use of sunstones, likely calcite or cordierite crystals, which could locate the sun even on overcast days. When rotated, these crystals would show different light intensities, allowing navigators to determine the sun's position through thick clouds. Combined with careful observation of waves, currents, stars, birds, and even the color of the water, Vikings could sail accurately across vast distances. They understood the patterns of the ocean in ways we're still trying to fully reconstruct. Without compasses or modern instruments, they crossed the North Atlantic repeatedly, finding Iceland, Greenland, and eventually America. Their knowledge was passed down through experience and oral tradition, each generation teaching the next to read the subtle language of the sea and sky. Vikings had a god of poetry and mead. Among the many gods in the Norse pantheon was Bragi, the god of poetry, music, and eloquence. According to myth, his words were so beautiful that runes would appear in the air as he spoke. He was married to Idun, the keeper of the golden apples that kept the gods young. Bragi represented the Viking appreciation for artistry and the spoken word, showing that their culture valued creative expression alongside martial prowess. In their worldview, the ability to compose a clever verse or tell a captivating story was a gift from the gods, just as much as strength in battle. When skalds composed their intricate poems, they were channeling Bragi's power. This divine connection between war and art, between the sword and the word, was central to how Vikings understood themselves and their place in the world. They believed trees could be sacred portals between worlds. At the center of Viking cosmology stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, an enormous ash that connected all 9 realms of existence. Its branches reached into the heavens, its roots plunged into various underworlds, and gods, humans, giants, elves, and the dead all lived on different levels connected by this single tree. Vikings saw individual trees as potentially sacred as well, sometimes holding assemblies beneath ancient trees or making offerings to particularly old or unusual specimens. Trees were liminal spaces, touching both earth and sky, and could serve as connections between the mortal world and the divine. When Vikings planted a high-seat pillar from their old home in a new land, they were establishing a sacred connection to place. This deep reverence for trees shows a spiritual connection to nature that shaped how they saw the landscape around them as alive and holy. Viking berserkers may have used drugs before battle. Among Viking warriors, berserkers were the most feared and famous. These fighters would work themselves into a trance-like fury before battle, allegedly feeling no pain and fighting with seemingly superhuman strength. The word berserk comes from them, possibly meaning bear shirt or bear shirt, referring to fighting without armor. How they achieved this state is debated. Some historians suggest they may have consumed muskimol containing mushrooms like Amanita muscaria, which can cause hallucinations and altered consciousness. Others propose they used ritualistic dancing, hyperventilation, or simply psychological conditioning. Whatever the method, berserkers were both valuable and dangerous, difficult to control once the fury took them. In sagas, they're described as biting their shields, howling, and fighting with wild abandon. Whether it was drugs, psychology, or spiritual practice, these warriors found a way to enter an altered state that made them legendary. They had a goddess who chose who would die in battle. The Valkyries were among the most compelling figures in Norse mythology. These female spirits, whose name means choosers of the slain, would fly over battlefields and select which warriors would die and which would live. Those deemed worthy were carried to Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok. Valkyries were not gentle guides, but fierce, powerful beings who served Odin's will. In some stories, they're depicted as beautiful maidens, in others as more terrifying figures. Their role reflected the Viking acceptance that death in battle wasn't random but chosen, that dying bravely meant joining a select group who would fight alongside the gods at the end of the world. This belief could make warriors fight with less fear, knowing that a worthy death would bring eternal glory rather than simple oblivion. Vikings settled in what is now Russia and gave it its name. The influence of Vikings, or more specifically the Varangians, as they were known in the East, extended far beyond Scandinavia. Swedish Vikings traveled down rivers into what is now Russia, establishing trading posts and eventually founding states. The name Russia itself likely derives from Russ, which may have come from the Norse word for rowers, or from a region in Sweden, These Norse traders and warriors integrated with Slavic populations, establishing the Kievan Rus, which became the foundation of medieval Russian culture. They served as mercenaries, traders, and eventually rulers, creating connections between Scandinavia and Byzantium. The Varangian Guard, the elite bodyguards of Byzantine emperors, were largely made up of Norse warriors. This eastern expansion is often overshadowed by Viking activities in Western Europe, but it was equally significant, shaping the development of Eastern European states. They carved runes for both magic and writing. The runic alphabet, called the Futhark after its first 6 letters, served Vikings both as a practical writing system and a magical tool. Runes could be carved into wood, stone, or metal to record ownership, commemorate the dead, or tell stories. But they were also believed to hold power. The god Odin himself sacrificed his eye and hung on Yggdrasil for 9 days to gain the knowledge of runes. Certain runes were thought to protect, to curse, to heal, or to bring luck. Vikings would carve them into weapons, ships, and amulets. Some runestones still stand today, telling of voyages, battles, and lost loved ones in these angular symbols that were both alphabet and magic spell. The act of carving runes was called risting, and those who could read and write them held special knowledge, a bridge between the everyday world and forces beyond ordinary understanding. Viking funerals could be elaborate ship burials. When a great Viking leader died, sometimes they were given a burial that matched their status, placed in a ship with grave goods, treasures, weapons, and sometimes even sacrificed animals or slaves, then buried under a mound or set aflame. The ship was meant to carry them to the afterlife, just as it had carried them through life. Archaeological discoveries, like the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, have shown us the incredible craftsmanship and wealth that could go into these burials. Not everyone received such treatment. Most Vikings had simpler graves. But the ship burial represents the ultimate honor, acknowledging that the person's journey didn't end with death, but continued into the next realm. The image of a burning ship drifting into the night, carrying a warrior to Valhalla, captures something essential about Viking beliefs: that death was not an ending, but a voyage into the unknown. They had a rich tradition of riddles and wisdom poetry. Vikings loved testing wit and wisdom through riddles and poetic challenges. The Eddas, collections of Old Norse poetry, contain entire dialogues where gods or heroes exchange riddles and philosophical questions. Odin himself was famous for his wisdom and would often travel in disguise to test mortals with difficult questions. These weren't just entertainment, but a way to demonstrate intelligence and knowledge, both highly valued in Norse culture. Wisdom poetry would offer advice on everything from friendship to warfare, condensed into memorable verses that could be easily remembered and passed down. In a culture without widespread writing, these oral traditions preserved knowledge and values across generations. Around the fire on long winter nights, Vikings would challenge each other, sharpening their minds just as they sharpened their blades, proving that the tongue could be as mighty as the sword. Vikings founded the city of Dublin. In 841, Vikings established a settlement called Dublin, meaning Black Pool, which became the city we now know as Dublin. This wasn't just a temporary camp, but a permanent trading post that grew into one of Ireland's most important cities. The Vikings didn't only raid Ireland, they settled, intermarried with locals, and became part of Irish society. They introduced new shipbuilding techniques, expanded the trade networks, and left their mark on Irish language and culture. Similar stories played out across the British Isles and beyond. Viking settlements became the seeds of major cities like York, Jorvik, Limerick, and Normandy. These Norse colonists gradually blended with local populations, creating hybrid cultures that were neither fully Viking nor fully native, but something new. The raiders became settlers, and the settlers became ancestors of millions. They had a complex class system with three main groups. Viking society was stratified into three main classes: thralls, slaves; carls, free farmers and craftsmen; and jarls, nobles. Thralls had no freedom and could be bought, sold, or inherited. Carls made up the majority and could own land, participate in assemblies, and had legal protections. Jarls were the wealthy elite, often controlling large estates and commanding warriors. But this system had some flexibility. A thrall could earn or buy their freedom and become a carl. A carl who accumulated enough wealth and followers might rise to jarl status. Honor and reputation mattered as much as birth. A man of low birth who distinguished himself in battle or trade could gain respect and status. This wasn't a rigid caste system, but a social structure that, while hierarchical, allowed for some movement. Your actions could define you as much as your ancestry. They had a concept of fate called wyrd that was inescapable. Vikings believed strongly in fate, which they called weird or urlog. This wasn't quite the same as predestination. They believed people had choices, but that the ultimate outcomes of life, especially death, were set by forces beyond mortal control. The Norns, three goddesses who lived by Yggdrasil's roots, wove the threads of every person's destiny. This belief in inevitable fate didn't make Vikings passive. Instead, it encouraged them to face challenges with courage, knowing that how they met their fate mattered more than trying to avoid it. A brave death was honorable. A cowardly attempt to escape destiny was shameful. This philosophy shaped their approach to battle, exploration, and life itself. If your fate was to die in a raid, you would die. But how you died, the story told about your courage, would live forever in the memories of those who survived. Viking traders reached as far as Baghdad. Vikings were not just raiders, but ambitious traders who established routes stretching from Scandinavia to the Middle East. Evidence shows they traveled down Russian rivers to the Caspian and Black Seas, eventually reaching Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate. There they traded furs, amber, slaves, and honey for silver, silk, spices, and other luxuries. Hoards of Islamic silver coins, called dirhams, have been found throughout Scandinavia, proof of these extensive trade connections. Some Vikings even converted to Islam, at least temporarily, to facilitate business. In Baghdad, the traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan left a detailed account of meeting and observing Rus Vikings, describing their tattoos, customs, and burial practices. These journeys show that Vikings were as interested in profit and exotic goods as they were in plunder, and that their reach extended far beyond the cold northern seas into the warm, wealthy civilizations of the East. They played a board game called Hnefatafl. During downtime, Vikings entertained themselves with games, particularly a strategic board game called Hnefatafl, which translates roughly to King's Table. This was a game of strategy similar to chess, played on a checkered board with one player controlling a king and his defenders, while the other controlled a larger force of attackers. The goal for the king was to escape to the edges of the board, for the attackers to capture him. Game boards and pieces have been found in Viking graves, showing how valued they were. A Shenefetafel required planning, tactics, and an understanding of asymmetric warfare, skills useful for real Viking leaders. In saga literature, the ability to play well was a mark of intelligence and nobility. These games were played by firelight in longhouses during endless winter nights, a quieter side of Viking life, where victory came through thought rather than strength. They had a rich mythology about giants as old as the gods. In Norse mythology, the giants, or Jotnar, were primordial beings who existed before the gods. They represented chaos, nature, and the untamed world. The first giant, Ymir, was killed by Odin and his brothers, and from his body they created the world. His flesh became earth, his blood the seas, his bones the mountains, and his skull the sky. Giants weren't always enemies. Sometimes they were lovers or allies of the gods. Thor famously fought giants repeatedly, but Odin sought wisdom from them. Some gods had giant ancestry, including Loki, whose complex relationship with the Aesir reflected the tension between order and chaos. The giants represented everything wild and unpredictable, living in Jotunheim beyond the boundaries of the gods' realm. This ongoing tension between gods and giants, order and chaos, would ultimately culminate in Ragnarok, when the old world would end and a new one would begin. Viking Age Scandinavians wore colorful clothing, not just browns and grays. Popular depictions often show Vikings in drab earth tones, but archaeological evidence reveals they loved color. They dyed their clothes using natural materials, red from madder root, yellow from weld plants, blue from woad, and various browns and greens from other sources. Fabric fragments found in graves show stripes, checks, and complex patterns. Wealthy Vikings wore silk imported from as far away as Byzantium or even China. Both men and women wore layers, linen undergarments, wool tunics and dresses, cloaks fastened with decorative brooches. Jewelry was common, not just for women but for men too, with arm rings, pendants, and elaborate belt fittings. Vikings took pride in their appearance. Looking good demonstrated wealth and status. Imagine a Viking marketplace not as a dull, muddy place, but as a riot of color. Bright reds, deep blues, rich greens, all woven and dyed with skill and worn with pride. They had elaborate laws about insults and honor. In Viking society, honor was everything, and laws reflected this. There were specific penalties for different types of insults. Calling a man unmanly or a coward could result in legal action, and in serious cases, the insulted party could challenge the accuser to a holmgang, a ritualized duel. Even lesser insults had defined consequences, often involving payment of fines. The most serious accusation was an accusation of being effeminate or taking a passive sexual role, which could be grounds for killing the accuser without legal penalty. This obsession with honor and reputation shaped daily interactions. Your word was your bond, and your reputation could outlive you in the stories told by skalds. Being remembered as honorable was worth more than gold. These honor codes, while strange to modern eyes, created a social order where personal reputation and public behavior were inseparably linked, and where defending one's name was taken as seriously as defending one's land. They believed in multiple afterlives, not just Valhalla. While Valhalla is the most famous, Vikings believed in several possible afterlives depending on how you died and who you were. Warriors who died in battle might go to Valhalla or to Folkvanger, the realm of the goddess Freya, who got first choice of half the slain. Those who died of sickness or old age might go to Hell, a realm that wasn't quite the Christian hell, but rather a shadowy, quiet place, ruled by the goddess Hel, Loki's daughter. Some believed the dead remained near their burial mounds. Others thought souls could be reborn within the same family. There was also mention of other afterlife locations for specific groups. This multiplicity shows a complex spiritual worldview that didn't reduce everything to simple binaries of heaven and hell, good and bad. Death was a transition, and where you went depended on the story of your life and the manner of your passing. Viking children learned to use weapons at a young age. In Viking society, training for life began early. Boys would start learning to handle weapons as young as 5 or 6, practicing with small versions of adult weapons. This wasn't necessarily about making child soldiers, but about survival and cultural values. Hunting, fighting, and defending oneself were essential skills in a world where danger was real and constant. Girls, meanwhile, learned spinning, weaving, cooking, and household management, skills equally essential for survival. But the boundaries weren't absolute. Some girls learned to fight, and boys learned domestic skills too. Physical games and sports like wrestling, swimming, and ball games helped develop strength and coordination. This early training meant that by adolescence, most Vikings were capable and competent, ready to take on adult responsibilities. Childhood was shorter in those times, and the practical education Vikings received prepared them for the harsh realities of their world. They had a holiday called Yule that influenced modern Christmas. Long before Christianity reached Scandinavia, Vikings celebrated Yule, a midwinter festival that lasted for several days around the winter solstice. They feasted, drank, made oaths for the coming year, and honored both gods and ancestors. Yule logs were burned, evergreen decorations brought inside represented continuing life through winter, and there were gifts and games. When Vikings converted to Christianity, many Yule traditions blended with Christmas celebrations. The timing, the feasting, the gift-giving, and even some symbols like holly and evergreens have roots that stretch back to this pagan celebration. The word Yule itself is still used in Scandinavian languages for Christmas. In the darkest part of winter, Vikings gathered together to celebrate light, warmth, and the promise that spring would return, creating traditions that have echoed through 1,000 years to shape how many celebrate winter holidays today. They could navigate using flight patterns of birds. Vikings were brilliant practical observers, and they used every natural clue available to navigate. One technique was following bird behavior. Certain seabirds only fly a certain distance from land before returning, so Vikings would carry ravens or observe local birds to gauge proximity to shore. If a raven flew off and didn't return, it had found land. This is mentioned in the sagas, where travelers would release birds to find their way to Iceland or other destinations. They also noted that different species appeared at different distances from land, creating a kind of biological GPS. Combined with their knowledge of currents, wave patterns, whale migrations, and the stars, Vikings built a comprehensive navigation system from observation and experience. These weren't just lucky guesses, but sophisticated understanding of natural patterns, passed down through generations, allowing them to cross oceans with remarkable accuracy considering they had no modern instruments whatsoever. Viking swords were often given names and treated as treasures. A Viking's sword wasn't just a tool, but a companion, an heirloom, and a part of their identity. Swords were expensive to make, requiring skilled smiths and quality iron, so owning one was a mark of wealth and status. Many were given names: leg biter, brain basher, skull splitter. These names appeared in sagas and were passed down through generations. A sword might be inherited from father to son, accumulating history and reputation with each wielder. Some swords were pattern welded, with multiple iron rods twisted together and forged to create beautiful, wavy patterns in the blade. The best swords were imported from Frankish lands and were so valuable that some have been found deliberately broken and placed in graves so their power wouldn't be misused. To carry a named sword was to carry part of your family's story, a connection to ancestors, and a promise to the future. They had a system of blood feuds that could last generations. When someone was killed or seriously wronged, Viking honor culture often demanded vengeance. This could start blood feuds where families would retaliate back and forth for generations. The sagas are full of these cycles of revenge, where one killing leads to another in an endless chain. To break this cycle, Vikings developed the weregild system, where blood money could be paid to the victim's family to settle the matter without further violence. The amount depended on the person's status and the nature of the crime. Accepting weregild was honorable, but some offenses were considered so serious that only blood could satisfy justice. Those feuds shaped Norse society, creating alliances and enemies that lasted centuries. They also created the dramatic material for many sagas, where heroes navigated the complex obligations of honor, revenge, and family loyalty, trying to be both strong and wise in a world where violence was always close at hand. They used a solar compass to navigate. Recent discoveries suggest Vikings may have used a simple but ingenious navigational tool called a solar compass. This was a wooden disc with a central gnomon, a stick casting a shadow, and markings around the edge. By measuring the shadow's length and direction at different times of day, navigators could determine latitude even when the sun was obscured by clouds, especially when combined with sunstones. These compasses had to be recalibrated for different latitudes as they traveled, showing sophisticated understanding of the sun's seasonal and geographic variations. While no complete example has been definitively proven, fragments and descriptions suggest such tools existed. Combined with their other techniques, dead reckoning, bird watching, and reading sea conditions, Vikings assembled a navigation toolkit that, while primitive by modern standards, was remarkably effective. They treated the journey itself as a skill to be learned and perfected, with navigators holding positions of great respect. Viking women could be buried with full honors as warriors. While debated among historians, several female burials contain weapons and equipment suggesting some women fought as warriors. The most famous is a grave in Birka, Sweden, originally assumed to be a male warrior, but later DNA testing revealed to be female. She was buried with a sword, axe, spear, arrows, and a strategy board, suggesting high status and possibly military leadership. Other similar burials have been found throughout Scandinavia. Whether these women actively fought in battles or held ceremonial military positions is still discussed, but their existence challenges the assumption that warfare was exclusively male. The sagas mention shield maidens like Lagertha, and while these may be partly legendary, they might preserve memories of real women who chose the warrior's path. Viking society, while patriarchal, seems to have had more flexibility in gender roles than we once assumed, allowing exceptional women to step beyond traditional bounds. They had a god who was prophesied to survive Ragnarok. While most gods were destined to die in Ragnarok, a few would survive to rebuild the world. Balder, the beloved god who was killed by trickery before Ragnarok, would return from hell to the renewed world. Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, would survive, as would Modi and Magni, Thor's sons, who would inherit their father's hammer Mjolnir. Hoenir, oddly silent god, would also endure. These survivors would gather in Idavol, where Asgard once stood, finding the golden chess pieces of the old gods in the grass and remembering what came before. Two humans, Lif and Lefthrasir, would emerge from hiding in Yggdrasil to repopulate the earth. This vision of renewal after destruction was central to Norse spirituality. The end was ne'er truly final. From the ashes of the old world, a new one would always grow. Even in their apocalypse myth, Vikings saw hope in continuation, a cosmic cycle that reflected the cycles of seasons, generations, and life itself. They used ice skates made from animal bones. In winter, when lakes and rivers froze, Vikings had a practical solution for travel: ice skates made from the leg bones of horses or cattle. These bones would be polished smooth and tied to shoes with leather straps. The skater would propel themselves forward using a staff or pole, gliding across frozen surfaces much faster than walking. Archaeological finds throughout Scandinavia have uncovered these bone skates, some showing significant wear from heavy use. While not as efficient as modern metal skates, they served their purpose, allowing Vikings to traverse winter landscapes and continue trade and communication even when usual routes were frozen. It's a reminder of their adaptability, always finding solutions to their environment's challenges. Imagine a Viking trader gliding across a frozen fjord at dawn, breath frosting in the air, bone skates clicking against the ice, moving goods and messages through a winter world. They had a rich tradition of wood carving and craftsmanship. Vikings were master woodworkers, creating everything from simple tools to elaborate ship decorations. Their work featured intricate patterns, interlacing animals, dragons, and geometric designs that covered everything from everyday objects to churches and ships. The Oseberg ship was covered in elaborate carvings, showing how even functional items could be artistic masterpieces. Stave churches built after the Viking Age continued these traditions, their doorways and walls covered in scenes from Norse mythology and Christian stories intertwined. Wood was abundant in Scandinavia, and Vikings used it for nearly everything: houses, ships, furniture, bowls, tools, even roads across marshy ground. A skilled woodcarver was valued, their work adding beauty to daily life and honoring the gods. In every carved spiral and stylized beast, you can see Vikings expressing their worldview, turning functional objects into art that has survived centuries to tell us about their aesthetic sense and spiritual imagination. They believed runes were discovered, not invented. In Norse mythology, runes weren't created by humans, but discovered by Odin through immense sacrifice. He hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, without food or water, looking down into the void. Through this ordeal, he perceived the runes and grasped them. This story reflects how Vikings viewed knowledge itself, as something existing eternally that must be won through sacrifice and worthy of respect. Learning to read and write runes wasn't just practical education, but a spiritual act, connecting oneself to this ancient wisdom that Odin had suffered to obtain. The runic alphabet wasn't just letters, but symbols imbued with power and meaning beyond simple phonetics. Each rune had a name and associated concepts: Fehu for wealth, Thurisaz for giants, Ansuz for gods. To carve runes was to tap into forces older than the world itself, wisdom purchased with divine suffering. Vikings had elaborate tattoos, though we're not certain of their designs. Historical accounts from travelers who met Vikings mention tattoos covering their bodies from fingertips to neck. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered Rus Vikings in 922, described them as having dark blue-green tree patterns and figures covering their skin. However, no Viking skin has survived with tattoos intact, so we can't know exactly what they looked like. Were they runes, images of gods and beasts, geometric patterns? The mystery remains. What's clear is that body modification was part of Viking culture, another way they expressed identity and status. In a society where appearance mattered, where grooming and dress indicated wealth and position, tattoos would have been permanent, declarations of belief, allegiance, or achievement. Each mark would have told a story, turning the body itself into a living text that others could read. They had a concept of luck that could be inherited or gifted. Vikings believed in hamingja, a kind of personal luck or spiritual power that could grow or diminish based on your actions and could even be transferred to others. A person with strong hamingja would succeed in their endeavors, while losing it meant failure and misfortune. Great leaders were thought to have powerful hamingja that protected not just themselves, but their followers. This luck could be passed down through families or given as a gift. When someone died, their hamingja might transfer to a descendant or even to someone they chose before death. It was treated almost like an invisible resource, something you cultivated through honorable deeds and courage. This belief shaped behavior. Acting honorably increased your luck, while shameful deeds diminished it. Your reputation, your honor, and your luck were all interconnected, forming your spiritual standing in the world. They made cheese that could last for years. In a time before refrigeration, preservation was crucial, and Vikings became experts at it. They made a hard cheese called gamelost, meaning old cheese, that could be aged for months or even years. The cheese was so hard, it had to be shaved or chipped rather than cut, but it was nutritious and could survive long sea voyages without spoiling. They also preserved fish by drying it into hard stockfish that would last indefinitely, and they fermented the various foods to extend their edibility. Pickling, smoking, salting, and drying were essential skills that allowed Vikings to survive harsh winters and long journeys. Their diet might seem limited by modern standards, but they were resourceful, ensuring that hunting, fishing, and farming in summer could sustain them through the lean months. Every household would have stores of preserved food hanging from rafters, testimony to careful planning and the hard-won knowledge of survival in northern climates. They could recite their family history back many generations. In a largely illiterate society, memory was everything. Vikings memorized extensive genealogies, often able to recite their family lineage back 10 or more generations. This wasn't just showing off. It established legal rights to land, inheritance, and social position. Knowing your ancestors connected you to their deeds and reputation, and through them to the founding of settlements and legendary heroes. The sagas, eventually written down, preserve some of these genealogies in intricate detail, showing how important these family connections were. During disputes over land or honor, witnesses would recite these lineages to establish claims. Children learned their ancestry like we might learn a multiplication tables, embedding it in memory through repetition. Your family tree wasn't abstract history, but living connection, a chain linking you to the past and projecting you into the future. They believed in creatures called draugr, the undead. Viking folklore included draugr, undead beings who haunted their burial mounds, often described as having superhuman strength and the ability to change size or shape. Unlike mindless zombies, draugr retained their personality and cunning, guarding their treasure jealously and killing anyone who disturbed their rest. Some could predict the future, others had magical abilities. The sagas tell of heroes who had to fight draugr, often requiring special methods to keep them dead, like beheading and burning the body, or placing the corpse in a way it couldn't escape its grave. These stories reflected real fears about the dead and the importance of proper burial. A person who died angry or was buried incorrectly might become draugr. It was one reason why burial customs were so carefully followed. The boundary between life and death was permeable, and the dead might not always stay peacefully buried. They used a primitive form of sunglasses to prevent snow blindness. Vikings who traveled in snowy regions faced the danger of snow blindness, caused by sunlight reflecting off white surfaces. To combat this, they may have used strips of leather or wood with narrow slits cut in them, worn over the eyes to reduce glare while still allowing enough vision to navigate. Similar devices were used by Arctic peoples for centuries. While no definitive Viking snow goggles have been found, the Inuit and other northern cultures used them, and it's logical that Vikings, with their presence in Iceland, Greenland, and exploration of northern Canada, would have developed or adopted similar technology. It's another example of practical problem solving, using simple materials to overcome environmental challenges. In a world without modern equipment, survival often came down to clever, simple solutions like these, passed down through observation and necessity. They had a goddess of marriage who also presided over childbirth. Frigg was Odin's wife and the queen of the Aesir, goddess of marriage, motherhood, and domestic arts. She knew the fates of all beings, but kept this knowledge to herself. Women would pray to Frigg for protection during childbirth and for harmony in their marriages. She was also associated with spinning and weaving, practical skills central to running a household. Unlike some male gods who sought adventure and glory, Frigg represented stability, wisdom, and the power found within the home. This wasn't diminishment. The household was the foundation of Viking society, and the woman who managed it held real authority. Frigg's status reflected how domestic roles, while different from warrior roles, were equally respected. In honoring her, Vikings acknowledged that creating and maintaining life was as worthy of divine attention as taking it in battle. They practiced a form of magic called cider. Cider was a type of Norse magic associated with prophecy, shaping fate, and communicating with spirits. It was often practiced by women called vulvas or sidekonas, who would enter trances to see the future or contact the dead. Interestingly, cider was considered somewhat unmanly for men to practice, yet even Odin learned it, showing its power overcame stigma. Practitioners would sit on elevated platforms, sometimes using songs and ritualistic movements to enter altered states. They might divine the weather, find lost objects, or curse enemies. This magic was treated as real and powerful, not superstition. People would consult satyr practitioners for important decisions, and their prophecies appear throughout the sagas. The practice shows Vikings believed in forces beyond the physical, that reality could be influenced through spiritual knowledge, and that some people had special abilities to navigate these hidden currents of fate and fortune. They traded extensively in slaves. One of the darker aspects of Viking culture was the slave trade. Thralls, as slaves were called, were a major commodity in Viking trade networks. Raids often aimed as much at capturing people as at seizing treasure. These slaves would be sold throughout Europe and the Middle East, and many Vikings became wealthy through this trade. The word slave itself comes from Slav, as many slaves were Slavic peoples captured in Eastern European raids. Life as a thrall was hard, with no rights and complete dependence on their owner's treatment. However, the system had some flexibility. Slaves could be freed, could earn money to buy their freedom, and their children might be born free if one parent was free. This doesn't excuse the practice, but shows it wasn't quite the chattel slavery of later eras. It remains a reminder that Vikings, for all their achievements, participated in institutions we now recognize as deeply wrong. They had an elaborate gift-giving culture. Gift-giving was central to Viking society, but it wasn't simple generosity. Gifts created obligations and built relationships. When a jarl gave a warrior a ring or weapon, the warrior was expected to serve loyally. Refusing a gift was insulting, but accepting meant entering a web of reciprocal duties. Excessive gift-giving demonstrated wealth and power, while stinginess showed weakness. Some gifts were symbolic. Giving a cloak might represent protection, while a sword implied expectation of service in battle. These exchanges built the social fabric, creating networks of loyalty and obligation that held society together. The sagas are full of gift exchanges, showing how a generous lord attracted the best warriors, and how gifts could create alliances between families or regions. In a world without formal contracts, gift-giving was how agreements were sealed, relationships formalized, and power demonstrated through generosity rather than hoarding. They believed bears had human-like intelligence. Vikings held bears in special regard, believing them to possess intelligence and even spiritual power comparable to humans. The word berserk probably comes from bear shirt, and warriors who wore bearskins in battle were thought to channel the bear's strength and fury. Hunting a bear was a test of courage and skill, and bear products, furs, claws, teeth, were valuable trade goods and symbols of prowess. In Norse mythology, some heroes could transform into bears, and the line between human and bear blurred in stories and beliefs. This respect wasn't sentimental, but acknowledged the bear as a formidable being, one of the few animals that could hunt humans as effectively as humans hunted it. Encountering a bear in the forest was meeting something powerful and unpredictable, worthy of both fear and admiration. They could tan leather to be soft or hard as needed. Viking leather workers were skilled craftsmen who could process animal hides into various materials. Soft leather was used for clothing, shoes, and bags, while harder leather could be boiled and shaped into armor, cups, or reinforcements. The tanning process involved scraping flesh from hides, treating them with bark tannins or other substances, and working them until they reached the right texture. Leather was everywhere in Viking life: clothing, belts, straps, shoes, weapon grips, saddles, boat parts, and more. A good leather worker was valuable to any community, transforming animal skins into durable, useful products. The smell of a leather workshop, the pungent mix of hides and tanning agents, would have been a familiar part of any Viking settlement, another trade that kept society functioning. They had a complex calendar based on lunar and solar observations. Vikings divided the year into two main seasons, summer and winter, with summer beginning in mid-April and winter in mid-October. They further divided these into months, but since they used a lunar calendar, it didn't quite match the solar year. They had to add extra months periodically to keep aligned with seasons. Weeks were organized around market days, and the concept of a 7-day week came later with Christianity. Vikings marked important dates for festivals, assemblies, and seasonal activities based on careful observation of sun, moon, and stars. This calendar reflected their agricultural life, timing planting and harvest, and their need to plan for winter survival. Time wasn't abstract, but tied directly to natural cycles and survival needs, measured not just by passage, but by the work each season demanded. They used raven banners as war standards. According to sagas and some historical accounts, Viking armies carried banners depicting ravens, Odin's sacred birds. These raven banners were believed to bring victory and were sometimes said to move or flutter on their own as an omen. The raven was associated with Odin, god of war and wisdom, and with battle itself, as ravens would gather to feed on the slain after combat. Flying a raven banner announced your dedication to Odin and struck fear into enemies. Some legendary banners had specific names and histories passed down through generations. Whether these banners actually had supernatural properties or simply served as powerful symbols of identity and divine favor, they represented Vikings' belief that battles were fought on both physical and spiritual planes, and that the gods watched and influenced the outcome. They made honey wine called mead that was sacred to the gods. Mead, fermented from honey and water, was the most important alcoholic drink in Viking culture, more valued than beer or ale. According to mythology, the mead of poetry was created from the blood of the wisest being and granted divine inspiration to those who drank it. Odin stole this mead from giants, and poets claimed their inspiration flowed from this divine source. Regular mead was consumed at feasts, ceremonies, and used in toasting oaths. Making good mead required skill, as fermentation could easily go wrong, and honey was relatively expensive, making it a luxury. The drink had ritual significance. Oaths sworn over mead were binding, and funeral feasts included mead to honor the dead. In the cold north, sitting around a fire with a horn of warm mead, telling stories and making promises for the future was one of life's great pleasures. They could forge swords using pattern welding techniques. Viking smiths were highly skilled metallurgists who used a technique called pattern welding to create superior blades. They would twist together rods of iron with different carbon contents, forge welding them into a single bar, then hammering this into a blade. The process created beautiful wavy patterns on the steel and produced blades that were both flexible and hard, less likely to break or bend. Not all swords were pattern welded, only the finest, and these were incredibly expensive. A good smith's reputation could spread widely, and their products were treasured. The smithing process was partly ritualistic, with some smiths believed to forge magic into blades along with steel. Weapons weren't mass-produced, but individually crafted, each one unique, explaining why Vikings named their swords and treated them as irreplaceable companions. They had words for different types of snow and ice. Living in harsh northern climates, Vikings needed precise language for their environment. They had multiple words distinguishing types of snow and ice: fresh powder, old crusty snow, sleet, ice that was safe to walk on, dangerous thin ice, and more. This vocabulary wasn't pedantic, but practical. Knowing the exact condition of snow or ice could mean the difference between safe travel and disaster. Similarly, they had specific words for types of wind, waves, and weather conditions. Language shaped how they perceived and navigated their world, giving them tools to communicate precisely about conditions that mattered for survival. This linguistic richness reflects deep observation and intimate knowledge of their environment, built over generations of living in close relationship with a landscape that was both beautiful and potentially deadly. They held markets where people from many lands gathered to trade. Major Viking trading centers like Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in Denmark, and Kaupung in Norway became international marketplaces where Norse traders met merchants from across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. These towns were cosmopolitan by medieval standards, with people speaking multiple languages, trading goods from distant lands, silk from China, silver from the Middle East, amber from the Baltic, furs from the north, and slaves from raids. These weren't just economic centers, but places where cultures mixed, ideas spread, and connections formed. Walking through a Viking marketplace would have been a sensory overload. Different languages, exotic smells of spices and perfumes, the glint of jewelry and weapons, the calls of merchants advertising their wares. For farmers from isolated settlements, visiting these towns offered glimpses of a much wider world. They had a goddess who lived in the sea and claimed drowned sailors. Ran was the goddess of the sea, wife of Aegir, and mother of the waves. She was feared by sailors, as she was said to use a net to drag drowning men down to her hall beneath the waves. Those who died at sea were said to join her realm, not going to Hell or Valhalla, but residing in the ocean depths. Vikings would sometimes carry gold to sea, so if they drowned, they could pay Ran for hospitality in her hall. This belief reflects the sea's dual nature in Viking life, source of food, wealth, and an exploration, but also of death and danger. Every Viking who set sail knew they might not return, that the sea could claim them at any moment. Ran embodied this uncertainty, a reminder that the waters that gave so much could also take everything away. They used a special technique to preserve fish without salt. In regions where salt was scarce or expensive, Vikings developed stockfish, a method of preservation through air drying. Fish, usually cod, were hung on wooden racks in the cold, dry air of northern Norway and Iceland. Over weeks, the fish would lose most of their moisture, becoming hard as boards. This stockfish would keep indefinitely, and could be reconstituted by soaking in water. It was lightweight, making it perfect for long journeys, and highly nutritious. Stockfish became a major export, shipped throughout Europe and beyond. Even today, variations of this technique are used in Scandinavia. The rows of fish hanging on racks, turning slowly in the wind, were a common sight in coastal Viking settlements, another example of working with their environment's challenges to create solutions that endured for centuries. They believed some people could shapeshift into animals. Shapeshifting, or hamrummer, was a magical ability attributed to certain powerful individuals in Norse culture. These people could send forth their hammer or spirit form as an animal, often a bear, wolf, or bird, while their body lay in a trance-like sleep. Warriors with this ability were particularly feared, as they could scout enemies or attack in animal form. The line between human and animal wasn't as fixed in Norse thinking as in modern Western thought. Some families were said to have animal spirits that protected them. These beliefs blurred boundaries between natural and supernatural, suggesting that reality had layers we couldn't always see, and that some individuals could navigate between worlds. Whether understood as literal transformation or spiritual projection, shapeshifting represented a kind of power that transcended normal human limitations. They had a complex understanding of different types of courage. Vikings distinguished between different forms of bravery. There was the hot courage of berserkers, frenzied and overwhelming. There was the cold courage of standing your ground despite fear, facing death calmly. There was the wisdom to know when to fight and when to negotiate, which also required courage. The sagas praise those who face death with wit and dignity, making jokes or clever remarks even at the moment of execution. This was seen as the highest form of courage, maintaining your composure and humanity even when all is lost. Recklessness without thought was less valued than calculated risk-taking. True courage, in Viking eyes, combined strength, wisdom, and self-control. It wasn't about never feeling fear, but about how you acted despite it, maintaining your honor and dignity regardless of circumstances. They created elaborate riddles that required cultural knowledge to solve. Viking riddles weren't simple word puzzles, but complex cultural codes requiring deep knowledge of mythology, nature, and society to decode. The Eddas contain riddle contests where the stakes could be life itself. For example, Odin in disguise trades riddles with a giant, and the one who cannot answer forfeits their life. Those riddles used kennings and metaphors, so sky's fish might mean birds, or wound sea might mean blood. Solving them demonstrated intelligence, education, and cultural fluency. They were entertainment, but also tests of wisdom, separating the clever from the ordinary. Long winter nights were passed exchanging riddles by firelight, sharpening minds while showing off knowledge. In a culture that valued both words and wit, riddles were serious business, a competitive display of mental acuity. They believed trees housed spirits and could be holy places. Certain trees in Viking lands were considered sacred, sometimes housing spirits or serving as sites for offerings and assemblies. Individual notable trees, often old, large, or unusually shaped, might be venerated as dwelling places of landvetter, land spirits who protected the region. Damaging such trees could bring misfortune. When Christian missionaries wanted to demonstrate the powerlessness of pagan gods, they would sometimes cut down sacred trees risking local fury. The world tree Yggdrasil, central to Norse cosmology, reflects this tree veneration on a cosmic scale. For Vikings, the landscape was alive and aware, populated with spirits who deserved respect. Trees standing between earth and sky, living for generations beyond human lifespans, were natural conduits between worlds, worthy of reverence and care. They had laws protecting certain animals during mating season. Viking law codes, though primarily concerned with human affairs, included provisions about animals, particularly protecting breeding livestock and regulating hunting. Some regions had restrictions on hunting certain animals during their mating or birthing seasons, recognizing the need for populations to reproduce. Killing another person's livestock came with heavy fines, scaled to the animal's value. These laws reflected practical understanding. Managing animal populations ensured continued resources. They also showed that Vikings, despite their warrior reputation, were primarily farmers and herders who understood the rhythms of nature and the need for sustainable practices. Their livelihood depended on careful stewardship of animals and land, creating a body of law that, while harsh by modern standards, showed awareness of ecological balance and long-term thinking. They used skis for both travel and warfare. In snowy Scandinavian winters, skis were essential transportation, and Vikings became skilled skiers by necessity. They used long wooden skis, often with a single pole for balance and propulsion. There are accounts of warriors fighting on skis, giving them mobility in deep snow where others would founder. Skiing also featured in their mythology. The god Ular was associated with skiing and archery, often depicted on skis with a bow. Ski making was a valued craft, with different designs for different snow conditions. Racing and ski jumping were probably recreational activities as well. What's now a sport was then basic winter survival technology, allowing Vikings to hunt, travel, and wage war regardless of snow depth. Their intimate relationship with winter and mastery of moving through it gave them advantages others lacked. They believed some lakes and springs had healing powers. Certain natural water sources were considered sacred, believed to hold healing properties or to be dwelling places of spirits. People would make pilgrimages to these sites, leaving offerings and drinking or bathing in the water for cures. Some springs were associated with particular goddesses or spirits. These beliefs continued even after Christianization, with holy wells and springs often being rededicated to saints but maintaining their sacred status. The practice reflects Vikings' animistic worldview, seeing nature itself as alive and powerful. Water, essential for life, was naturally venerated. Whether these waters truly had healing properties, perhaps from minerals, or whether faith itself provided comfort and psychological healing, visiting them was an important spiritual and medicinal practice woven into the fabric of life. They had a god of poetry who was also associated with wisdom. Bragi, whose name is related to the word brag, meaning poetry, was the god of poets and eloquence. He was known for his wisdom and skill with words, married to Idun, the keeper of the apples of youth. When warriors arrived in Valhalla, Bragi would welcome them with poetry. This connection between poetry and divine wisdom shows how Vikings valued articulate speech and artistic expression. The best poets weren't just entertainers, but preservers of history and culture, their verses carrying forward the deeds of heroes and the wisdom of ages. Invoking Bragi or asking for his gift meant seeking the ability to use language powerfully and beautifully. In a culture where reputation depended partly on how you were remembered in poems and stories, a god devoted to this craft made perfect sense. They could tan leather using tree bark. The tanning process, which transforms raw hide into durable leather, used tannins found in tree bark, particularly oak. Vikings would strip bark, soak it in water, and use this tannin-rich solution to treat hides. The process took weeks or months, but produced leather that wouldn't rot and was supple enough for clothing or bags. Different trees and techniques produced different qualities of leather. This knowledge was crucial for survival, turning animals killed for meat into materials for clothing, shoes, and tools. Every part of an animal was used, reflecting both practical necessity and perhaps spiritual respect for the creatures that sustained human life. The leather worker's craft, smelly and labor-intensive as it was, provided one of life's essentials, making it a respected and necessary trade in every settlement. They had festivals marking the changing of seasons. Viking religious calendar centered around seasonal festivals. Winter nights in October marked the beginning of winter and included sacrifices for a good year. Yule in midwinter celebrated the turning of the year toward light, and other celebrations marked spring and summer. These festivals involved feasting, drinking, games, and religious ceremonies, including animal sacrifices to the gods. They served both spiritual and social functions, bringing communities together during breaks in the agricultural cycle. At a time before regular calendars or clocks, these festivals marked time's passage and reinforced communal bonds. They were times when normal work stopped, when stories were told and retold, when marriages might be arranged and disputes settled. The rhythm of Viking life followed these seasonal festivals, connecting daily existence to larger cosmic cycles and maintaining traditions passed down through countless generations. They valued poetry that could be understood on multiple levels. The best skaldic poetry wasn't straightforward, but layered with meaning. A skilled poet could compose verses that simultaneously described a battle while using kennings that referenced mythology, praised the patron without being obvious, and fit strict metrical requirements all at once. Listeners enjoyed unpacking these layers, finding connections and meanings beneath the surface. This complexity meant poetry required both skill to compose and intelligence to fully appreciate. A really clever verse might be recited and discussed for days as people discovered new interpretations. This wasn't pretension, but the natural result of a culture that valued verbal artistry and had long winter nights to devote to appreciating it. Poetry became a kind of puzzle, entertainment, history, and art all combined, practiced at the highest levels of society and preserved with reverence. They navigated using the color and temperature of ocean water. Experienced Viking navigators could tell their location by observing subtle differences in seawater. Color might indicate proximity to land or depth, with coastal waters showing different hues than deep ocean. Temperature changes could indicate currents or nearby land masses. They noted how water tasted. Fresher water might mean they were near glacial outflows or river mouths. Wave patterns changed near islands or coastlines. By paying close attention to these variations, along with their other navigation techniques, Vikings built a mental map of the ocean. This knowledge took years to develop and was carefully taught from experienced sailors to apprentices. It wasn't magic, but acute observation and deep familiarity with their environment. The ocean, which looks like featureless water to us, was to them a landscape full of readable signs pointing the way home, and they told stories that still echo in our world today. Perhaps the Vikings' greatest legacy isn't their raids or their craftsmanship, but their stories. The myths they told around fires, the sagas they recited from memory, the poetry they composed to honor the fallen, these narratives survived the centuries. They were written down by Christian monks who found them too powerful to ignore. They influenced Tolkien's Middle-earth, Wagner's operas, and countless modern books, movies, and games. The days of our week are named after their gods: Wednesday for Odin, Woden, Thursday for Thor, Friday for Frigg or Freya. Words they spoke entered English: berserks, ransack, slaughter, husband, scasse, egg, and hundreds more. Their legal concepts influenced governance across Northern Europe. Their shipbuilding techniques persisted for centuries. But more than these tangible things, Vikings gave us a way of seeing the world, practical yet imaginative, fatalistic yet courageous, valuing both strength and wisdom. They remind us that people 1,000 years ago were not so different from us. They loved, fought, feared, hoped, and told stories to make sense of their lives. And those stories, carried forward through the ages, still have the power to stir something deep within us, a recognition of the eternal human struggle to find meaning, honor, and a place in this vast, mysterious world. And so, our journey through the Viking world comes to a gentle close. We've sailed across cold northern seas, walked through settlements where smoke rose from longhouses, and listened to skalds recite verses by firelight. We've seen how these people, so often reduced to simple stereotypes, were in truth layered and complex: farmers and poets, traders and warriors, people who valued cleanliness and cleverness as much as courage, who built democracies and told stories that still shape our imagination. The Vikings were not angels or devils, but humans living in a harsh world and making the best of it they could. They created beauty, intricate jewelry, soaring poetry, elegant ships. They created structures, legal systems, trade networks, settlements that became great cities, and they created stories, myths, and sagas that have outlived their tellers by 1,000 years, still speaking to us across that vast gulf of time. As you rest now, perhaps you can picture a longship cutting through morning mist, its dragon prow pointing toward an unknown horizon, or a great hall filled with the sound of stories and laughter, warriors and poets gathered around a central fire, or a trader in a distant market, far from home, connecting worlds through commerce and curiosity. The Vikings remind us that every age has its own kind of greatness, its own struggles and triumphs. They faced their challenges with courage and creativity, leaving behind traces we can still see if we look closely, in language, in place names, in traditions that have woven themselves into the fabric of the modern world. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, feel free to like and subscribe, or share your thoughts in the comments below. It helps others find these calm explorations too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, there's nothing more you need to do. The Vikings have had their say, their stories have been told, and the long ships have sailed into the sunset of memory. If sleep calls to you, let it come gently. If you're still awake, you're welcome to continue exploring, or simply to let these images and ideas drift slowly through your mind like clouds across a Nordic sky. Thank you for sailing with me tonight through these northern waters of history. Rest well, and remember, even 1,000 years from now, someone might be telling your story too. Good night.